The morning mist clung to Charleston Harbor like a shroud of uncertainty. But Major Robert Anderson knew that April 12, 1861, would be remembered as the day America's heart was torn in two. Standing atop the ramparts of Fort Sumter, he gazed across the dark waters toward the Confederate batteries that had been assembled with methodical precision over the past months. The fortress beneath his feet, built to protect Charleston from foreign invaders, now found itself the unlikely epicenter of a brewing civil war. Anderson's weathered hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his field glasses. The 67 men under his command represented the last vestige of federal authority. In South Carolina, a state that had declared its independence from the Union for months earlier, the irony was not lost on him that he, a Kentucky-born soldier, who had once owned slaves, now stood as the unwitting symbol of Union defiance in the heart of the Confederacy. The tension had been building for weeks. South Carolina's secession in December 1860 had created an impossible situation. Anderson had moved his small garrison from the more vulnerable Fort Moultrie to Fort Sumter, under cover of darkness, a decision that had enraged Confederate authorities. They saw it as an act of aggression, while Anderson viewed it as a necessary tactical move to protect his men and maintain his duty to the federal government. Food supplies were running dangerously low. The Confederate forces under General Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard had effectively blockaded the fort, preventing any resupply missions. Anderson's men had been reduced to eating salt pork and hardtack, their meals growing smaller each day. The psychological pressure was perhaps even more crushing than the physical deprivation. These were American soldiers surrounded by other Americans, all speaking the same language, sharing the same history, yet poised to shed each other's blood. President Abraham Lincoln faced an impossible choice. Resupplying Fort Sumter might be seen as an act of war, potentially driving the remaining border states into the Confederate camp. Yet abandoning the fort would signal federal weakness and legitimize secession. Lincoln's decision to send a relief expedition, announced publicly to avoid accusations of deception, had set the stage for the current crisis. Beauregard, a man of honor who had once been Anderson's student at West Point, found himself in an equally agonizing position. The Louisiana Creole general had received explicit orders from Confederate President Jefferson Davis demand the fort's surrender, and if refused, reduce it to rubble. The personal connection between the two commanders added another layer of tragedy to the unfolding drama. As dawn broke over Charleston Harbor, church bells across the city began to toll. Citizens gathered on rooftops and along the waterfront, some bringing picnic baskets as if attending a sporting event. They had no conception of the horror that war would bring. Viewing the impending bombardment as a grand spectacle, ladies in their finest dresses and gentlemen in formal attire created a surreal backdrop to what would become the opening act of America's bloodiest conflict. The die was cast. Anderson knew that within hours, cannons would roar and the nation would be plunged into fratricidal war. He whispered a prayer for his men, for his country, and for the soul of a nation about to be torn asunder by its own contradictions. The white flag of truce fluttered in the pre-dawn darkness. As a small boat approached Fort Sumter's wharf, Colonel James Chestnut, Jr., former United States Senator from South Carolina, stepped onto the wooden dock with the gravity of a man delivering a death sentence. Accompanying him were Captain Stephen Dilley and Lieutenant Alexander Robert Chisholm, their faces etched with the solemnity of the moment. Anderson received the Confederate delegation in his sparse quarters, the oil lamp casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. The formal demand for surrender was read aloud, its words echoing with the weight of history. Beauregard, through his emissaries, offered honorable terms. Anderson and his men could depart with their personal property, their flags, and their dignity intact. No bloodshed need occur if the major would simply lower the stars and stripes and march away. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Anderson's mind raced through his options, but his duty remained clear. He could not abandon his post without explicit orders from Washington. His voice, when it finally came, was steady but heavy with emotion. "Gentlemen, I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your communication and to say that I cannot comply with your demand." Chestnut's expression remained impassive, though privately he hoped Anderson might reconsider. The two men had known each other for years, and Chestnut understood the impossible position in which the major found himself. As the Confederate delegation prepared to depart, Anderson made one final attempt at forestalling the inevitable. "I will await the first shot," he said quietly, "and if you do not batter us to pieces, we shall be starved out in a few days." Historical accounts from the Charleston Mercury would later describe the tension in the city as electric with anticipation. The Confederate commissioners returned to their headquarters at the Mills House Hotel, where they composed their final ultimatum. At 3:30 in the morning on April 13th, they dispatched their last message to Anderson: surrender within 1 hour or face bombardment. Captain Abner Doubleday, Anderson's second in command, found his commander standing alone on the parade ground, staring up at the flag that snapped in the harbor breeze. The two men had served together for years, and Doubleday could read the anguish in his superior's weathered features. "Sir," he said softly. "The men are ready." Anderson nodded slowly. His garrison consisted of 68 enlisted men, 8 officers, and 43 civilian workmen who had volunteered to stay and help defend the fort. They were vastly outnumbered by the Confederate forces, which included several thousand troops and dozens of artillery pieces, positioned on the surrounding islands and shoreline. As the deadline approached, the city of Charleston seemed to hold its collective breath. On the Battery, the elegant promenade where the city's elite had strolled for generations, crowds gathered despite the early hour. The scene was almost festive, with vendors selling refreshments and children pointing excitedly toward the harbor. Few understood that they were witnessing the end of one America and the birth of another. At 4:30 in the morning, the Confederate signal gun fired from Fort Johnson. The single shot echoed across the harbor like a thunderclap, its sound carrying the weight of inevitability. Anderson closed his eyes for a moment, knowing that the next sound would be the first shot of a war that would consume hundreds of thousands of lives. The emotional toll on both sides was palpable. Confederate gunners hesitated at their posts, knowing they were about to fire on fellow Americans. In Fort Sumter, Anderson's men stood ready at their guns, their faces grim with determination and sorrow. The bonds of union, forged in the crucible of the Revolution and strengthened through nearly 9 decades of shared history, were about to be severed by cannon fire. At 4:30 in the morning on April 13th, 1861, the first mortar shell arched through the darkness like a falling star. Edmund Ruffin, the white-haired Virginia Phi reader who had spent years preaching secession, claimed the honor of firing the opening shot from the iron battery on Morris Island. The shell burst directly over Fort Sumter's parade ground, its flash illuminating the fortress walls in stark relief against the dawn sky. The bombardment that followed was unlike anything America had ever witnessed. 43 Confederate guns unleashed a devastating barrage from 4 different positions: Fort Moultrie, Fort Johnson, the floating battery, and the iron battery. The thunder of artillery rolled across Charleston Harbor in continuous waves, rattling windows throughout the city and sending tremors through the earth itself. Inside Fort Sumter, Major Anderson's men pressed themselves against the walls as Confederate shells screamed overhead. The fortress shook with each impact, mortar dust raining down from the vaulted ceilings. Sergeant John Carmody, a veteran of the Mexican War, muttered prayers between explosions while loading his cannon. The defenders had only limited ammunition and strict orders to conserve their shots, making each Confederate volley feel like an unanswered challenge. Captain Doubleday commanded the first return fire from the Union garrison. At 7 in the morning, he aimed his cannon at the iron battery and pulled the lanyard. The shot fell short, but the symbolic significance was immense. The Union had answered the Confederate challenge, and the war was now truly joined. "The ball has opened," Doubleday would later write in his memoirs, "and the first shot of the Civil War has been fired." The emotional strain on both sides was extraordinary. Confederate gunners could see the stars and stripes still flying defiantly above Fort Sumter, and many felt conflicted about firing on the flag they had once served. Captain John Rutledge, commanding one of the batteries, reportedly wept as he gave the order to continue firing. On the Union side, Anderson's men fought with desperate determination, knowing they were vastly outnumbered, but refusing to yield. As the day progressed, the bombardment intensified. According to contemporary reports from the Charleston Courier, the Confederate forces fired approximately 4,000 rounds during the 34-hour siege. The accuracy was remarkable, with many shells finding their mark on the fort's walls and buildings. The officers' quarters caught fire multiple times, forcing Anderson's men to fight both enemy artillery and advancing flames. The civilian population of Charleston watched the spectacle with a mixture of excitement and horror. Mary Boykin Chestnut, wife of Colonel James Chestnut, recorded in her famous diary, "The sound of those guns makes regular meals impossible. I do not pretend to go to sleep. How can I? If Anderson does not accept terms at 4, the orders are he shall be fired upon." The reality of war was beginning to sink in. Even as the carnival atmosphere persisted along the battery, inside the fort, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The Confederate hot-shot cannonballs heated red-hot in furnaces set the wooden structures ablaze repeatedly. Smoke filled the casemates, making breathing difficult and visibility nearly impossible. The men worked in shifts, some manning the guns while others fought fires with buckets of water drawn from the harbor. Anderson faced an agonizing decision as the day wore on. His ammunition was running low, his men were exhausted, and the fort's defenses were being systematically destroyed. Yet the flag still flew, and his duty remained clear. He would not surrender Fort Sumter while his men could still fight. The psychological impact extended far beyond Charleston Harbor. Telegraph wires carried news of the bombardment across the nation within hours. In Washington, President Lincoln received regular updates, his face growing graver with each dispatch. In Richmond, Jefferson Davis and his cabinet celebrated what they saw as the Confederacy's first military victory. The nation was witnessing its own violent division in real time. The second day of bombardment dawned with no relief in sight. For the beleaguered garrison of Fort Sumter, the Confederate artillery had found their range, and their shells now struck with deadly precision. The fort's flagstaff had been shot away twice, only to be heroically re-erected by Sergeant Peter Hart and his detail under heavy fire each time. The stars and stripes rose again. A cheer went up from the defenders, their voices hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. Major Anderson moved through the smoke-filled casemates like a ghost, checking on his men and assessing the damage. The heat inside the fort had become unbearable as fires continued to rage in the wooden structures. The men's faces were blackened with soot, their uniforms torn and singed. Private John Thompson, barely 18 years old, worked alongside veterans. 3 times his age, his youth forgotten in the crucible of battle. The Confederate forces showed no signs of letting up. General Beauregard had positioned his guns with mathematical precision, creating overlapping fields of fire that made any movement within the fort extremely dangerous. The Iron Battery, commanded by Captain William Ransom Calhoun, maintained a steady rate of fire that chipped away at the fort's masonry walls. Each hit sent chunks of stone flying like shrapnel, forcing the defenders to seek shelter wherever they could find it. Captain Doubleday organized the return fire with military precision, but the Union guns were severely outmatched. The fort's artillery had been designed to repel naval attacks, not to engage in a prolonged duel with shore batteries. Many of the cannon were mounted on the upper tier, exposed to Confederate fire, making them nearly impossible to serve effectively. The few shots the garrison managed to fire had little effect on the well-protected Confederate positions. As the afternoon wore on, a new crisis emerged. The fire that had been smoldering in the officers' quarters suddenly erupted into an inferno, threatening to reach the fort's powder magazine. Anderson ordered his men to remove the gunpowder barrels and scatter the powder to prevent a catastrophic explosion. The sight of Union soldiers dumping precious ammunition into the harbor, while under fire, struck many observers as a powerful symbol of the South's determination to resist federal authority. The emotional toll on the defenders was becoming evident. Several men had collapsed from exhaustion and smoke inhalation. Hospital steward James Crawford moved among the wounded, doing what he could with limited medical supplies. The men's morale remained surprisingly high despite their desperate situation. Sustained by their sense of duty and their respect for Major Anderson's leadership, Charleston's civilian population continued to watch the siege with fascination, though the initial carnival atmosphere had given way to something more sober. According to reports in the Charleston Mercury, the ladies of the city have organized relief efforts for the wounded, should any Confederate casualties result from the engagement. The reality that war meant suffering was beginning to penetrate the public consciousness inside the fort. Anderson called his officers together for a council of war. The situation was desperate. Ammunition was nearly exhausted, the fort was on fire, and several of his men were injured. Yet surrender seemed unthinkable while the flag still flew and his men remained willing to fight. Captain Samuel Crawford, the fort's surgeon, argued that further resistance was futile and would only result in unnecessary casualties. Captain Doubleday countered that abandoning the fort would be seen as a betrayal of their oath to defend federal property. The debate was interrupted by another direct hit on the fort's walls. A shell from the floating battery struck the parade ground, sending debris flying in all directions. Private Daniel Huff threw himself over a wounded comrade, taking shrapnel in his shoulder. The scene embodied the courage and sacrifice that would characterize the coming war. As evening approached, the Confederate bombardment showed no signs of slackening. The psychological pressure was enormous, as Anderson's men knew they were fighting a losing battle. Yet they continued to serve their guns and fight the fires, driven by a combination of duty, pride, and stubborn determination that would become legendary in American military history. The morning of April 14, 1861, brought no respite to the defenders of Fort Sumter. The Confederate bombardment had continued through the night, and the fortress was now more ruined than military installation. Major Anderson stood amid the wreckage of what had once been the pride of Charleston Harbor's defenses, his uniform torn and his face blackened with smoke and powder residue. The ammunition crisis had reached its breaking point. The garrison had fired only a few hundred rounds in response to the thousands hurled at them by Confederate artillery. The cartridge bags were nearly gone, and the men had been reduced to using their flannel shirts to wrap the remaining charges. Private John Irwin, the fort's drummer boy, had volunteered to help carry powder charges despite being only 16 years old, his courage inspiring the veteran soldiers around him. The fire situation had become critical. Flames now engulfed most of the wooden structures within the fort, and the smoke was so thick that the men could barely see each other across the parade ground. The heat was becoming unbearable, with the temperature inside the casemates rising to furnace-like levels. Several defenders had already succumbed to smoke inhalation and had to be carried to the relative safety of the casemates. Facing away from the Confederate batteries. At 11 in the morning, a Confederate shell struck the flagstaff once again, sending the stars and stripes tumbling to the ground. This time, the damage was too severe for immediate repair. As the flag lay crumpled on the smoke-shrouded parade ground, a profound silence seemed to settle over Charleston Harbor. Even the Confederate gunners paused their bombardment, uncertain whether this signaled surrender or was merely another temporary setback. Sergeant Peter Hart, who had already risked his life twice to raise the colors, looked to Major Anderson for orders. The major's face was etched with anguish as he stared at the fallen flag. For 34 hours, those stars and stripes had defied the Confederate bombardment, becoming a symbol of Union resolve. Now, with his ammunition exhausted and his fort burning around him, Anderson faced the most difficult decision of his military career. The emotional weight of the moment was crushing. Anderson had served his country faithfully for over 30 years, fighting in the Black Hawk War, the Second Seminole War, and the Mexican-American War. He had never surrendered to an enemy, and the prospect of doing so now filled him with profound sorrow. Yet his duty to his men was equally clear. Further resistance would serve no military purpose and would only result in unnecessary casualties. Captain Doubleday approached his commander with a heavy heart. "Sir," he said quietly, "the men are ready to continue fighting if you give the order." Anderson looked round at his smoke-blackened garrison. These brave men who had stood by him through the worst bombardment in American military history. Their loyalty and courage humbled him, but he could not ask them to die for a symbolic gesture. The decision was made more poignant by a gesture from the Confederate side. General Beauregard, recognizing the hopelessness of the Union position, sent his aide-de-camp, Colonel Louis Trezevant Wigfall, to Fort Sumter under a flag of truce. Wigfall, a former United States Senator from Texas, had actually rode out to the fort on his own initiative. Moved by respect for Anderson's gallant defense, Major Anderson, Wigfall called out as he climbed through a cannon embrasure, "General, Beauregard wants to stop this. You have defended your flag nobly, sir. You have done all that duty requires." The sight of this Confederate officer, his uniform immaculate despite the surrounding destruction, addressing the soot-covered Union commander, created a moment of surreal civility amid the chaos of war. Anderson's response was measured and dignified. "Colonel Wigfall, I appreciate General Beauregard's consideration. My ammunition is exhausted. My quarters are on fire, and several of my men require medical attention. I believe the time has come to discuss terms." The words came slowly, each one weighted with the gravity of surrender. The white flag was raised over Fort Sumter at 2:30 in the afternoon on April 14, 1861. As the symbol of truce fluttered above the battered fortress, the Confederate batteries fell silent for the first time in 34 hours. The sudden quiet was almost as shocking as the bombardment had been, leaving both sides to contemplate what they had begun. The negotiations that followed the raising of the white flag were conducted with the elaborate courtesy that characterized 19th century military tradition. General Beauregard's representatives arrived at Fort Sumter within the hour, their polished uniforms and formal bearing creating a stark contrast to the destruction surrounding them. Colonel Louis Trezevant Wigfall, who had initiated the surrender discussions, was joined by Captain Stephen Dill Lee and Major David Rumph Jones, all men who understood the gravity of the moment. Major Anderson received the Confederate delegation in what remained of his quarters, the walls still warm from the recent fires. Despite his exhaustion and the emotional weight of surrender, he maintained his military bearing. The terms offered by General Beauregard were remarkably generous, reflecting both the respect he held for his former instructor and the Confederate desire to begin the war. With a demonstration of Southern honor and magnanimity, the Union garrison would be permitted to fire a salute to their flag before lowering it, a symbolic gesture that acknowledged their gallant defense. Anderson and his men could march out with their personal property, their arms, and their dignity intact. They would be transported to any northern port of their choosing, with safe passage guaranteed. No one would be treated as a prisoner of war, and the wounded would receive medical care equal to that provided to Confederate soldiers. The emotional impact of these generous terms was profound. Captain Doubleday, writing in his journal, noted that several of the Confederate officers appeared moved by the destruction they witnessed within the fort. The walls were pockmarked with shell holes, the wooden structures were reduced to charred ruins, and the parade ground was littered with debris. Yet somehow, miraculously, not a single man had been killed during the 34-hour bombardment. As news of the surrender spread through Charleston, the city erupted in celebration. Church bells rang throughout the afternoon, and crowds gathered in the streets to cheer the Confederacy's first military victory. According to contemporary accounts from the Charleston Courier, the whole city is in a state of jubilation, with citizens embracing in the streets and toasting the gallant defenders of Southern rights. The reality of what this victory would ultimately cost had not yet sunken. The ceremony of surrender was scheduled for the following day, April 15, 1861. Anderson requested permission to fire a 50-gun salute to the flag, one shot for each state in the Union. The irony was not lost on anyone present that the symbolic gesture would honor states that were no longer united, a nation that was already divided against itself. That evening, as the sun set over Charleston Harbor, Anderson gathered his men for a final address. The officers and enlisted men assembled in the shot-torn casemates, their faces reflecting the flickering light of the fires that still smoldered throughout the fort. The major's voice was steady, but those who knew him well could detect the emotion beneath his military composure. "Gentlemen," he began, "we have conducted ourselves with honor during these trying days. No man among you has failed in his duty, and our flag has flown proudly above this fort for 34 hours, under the most severe bombardment. Tomorrow we will lower that flag with the same honor with which we have defended it." The men listened in silence, understanding that they were participants in a moment that would be remembered as long as America endured. Private Daniel Huff, who had been wounded while protecting a comrade, spoke for many when he said, "Sir, we're proud to have served under you. Whatever comes next, we'll remember Fort Sumter." The sentiment was echoed by nods and murmurs of agreement from throughout the assembled garrison. The Confederate guards, who had been posted around the fort, maintained a respectful distance, understanding that they were witnessing something profound. Many of these Southern soldiers had served alongside Union troops in the antebellum army, and the sight of their former comrades preparing for surrender filled them with complex emotions. War, they were beginning to understand, was not the romantic adventure that many had imagined. As the night deepened, both sides prepared for the ceremony that would formally end the siege of Fort Sumter. The fortress that had been built to protect Charleston from foreign enemies had become the altar upon which the old Union was sacrificed, and from its ashes would rise a conflict that would reshape the American nation forever. The morning of April 15th, 1861, dawned clear and bright over Charleston Harbor, as if nature itself sought to provide a fitting backdrop for the solemn ceremony about to unfold. Major Anderson and his men had spent the night preparing for their departure, packing their few belongings and making ready for the flag-lowering ceremony that would mark the end of their 34-hour ordeal. The 50-gun salute to the flag was to be the final act of Union defiance at Fort Sumter. Anderson had personally supervised the preparation of the remaining cannon, ensuring that this last gesture would be conducted with the precision and dignity befitting the occasion. The irony was bitter. The same guns that had defended the fort against Confederate attack would now fire a farewell salute to the flag they had protected. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the ceremony began. The small garrison formed up on the parade ground, their torn uniforms and powder-blackened faces bearing witness to their ordeal. The regimental band, reduced to a single drummer and fifer, played Yankee Doodle as the men came to attention. The stars and stripes, tattered by shell fragments, but still recognizable, hung limply from its makeshift staff in the still harbor air. The first shots of the salute rang out across the water, their echoes rolling back from the surrounding islands and the city beyond. Confederate soldiers and civilians watched respectfully from their positions, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in American history. Never before had an American flag been lowered in surrender to other Americans, and the weight of that moment pressed upon everyone present. It was during the 47th round of the salute that tragedy struck. Private Daniel Huff was loading his cannon when a spark ignited the powder prematurely. The explosion threw him backward, and he died instantly, the first casualty of the Civil War, killed not by enemy fire, but by an accident during the ceremony of surrender. Private Edward Galloway was mortally wounded in the same explosion and would die within hours. The sudden violence shattered the solemnity of the moment. Anderson, his face drained of color, ordered the salute to cease immediately. The remaining 3 shots would never be fired, leaving the ceremony incomplete, a fitting metaphor for the broken Union they were leaving behind. As the smoke cleared, the full horror of what had happened became apparent, and both Union and Confederate officers rushed to aid the wounded. The flag was lowered in silence, the planned ceremony abandoned in the face of tragedy. Anderson personally folded the colors, his hands trembling with emotion and exhaustion. This flag had flown over Fort Sumter for months, had withstood the most intensive bombardment in American military history, and now it was being retired not in glory but in sorrow. The major carefully placed it in his personal trunk, determined that it would someday fly again over the fort. He was being forced to abandon. General Beauregard, upon learning of the accident, immediately offered his personal physician to treat the wounded and volunteered to delay the evacuation if needed. The gesture exemplified the complex emotions on both sides. Enemies, who were also countrymen, soldiers who respected each other despite their political differences. The reality of war, with its capacity for random tragedy and senseless loss, was beginning to intrude upon the romantic notions that had sustained both sides. The Union garrison departed Fort Sumter that evening aboard the steamship Isabel, bound for New York. As the ship pulled away from the wharf, Anderson stood at the stern, watching the fortress disappear into the harbor mist. The Confederate flag now flew above the walls he had defended so gallantly, and the sight filled him with a profound sense of loss that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The bombardment of Fort Sumter had lasted 34 hours, during which approximately 4,000 rounds were fired. Miraculously, the only casualties were the 2 men killed in the accidental explosion during the surrender ceremony. Yet the battle's true significance lay not in its military casualties, but in its political consequences. The attack on Fort Sumter galvanized Northern opinion and provided President Lincoln with the justification he needed to call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. As the Isabel steamed northward through the Atlantic, swells carrying its cargo of defeated but unbroken soldiers, the nation they had sworn to serve was mobilizing for a war that would consume more than 600,000 lives. The emotional siege that had split the nation in two was complete, and the real war, longer, bloodier, and more terrible than anyone could imagine, was just beginning. The Battle of Fort Sumter had ended not with a bang but with a whimper, yet it had set in motion forces that would reshape America forever. In the words of one contemporary observer, the old Union died in Charleston Harbor, and from its ashes rose a new nation, baptized in blood and dedicated to the proposition that no house divided against itself can stand.